Thank you again. So I'm McNamee. I'm a professor of ethics at Swansea University, and I played a bit of college football for my university, but that was a long time ago, and it has nothing to do, I think, with the serious issues you're going to address. So as with previous panels, we have 15 minutes of presentations. That should leave us a good half an hour for discussions. I'm going to allow each of the presenters to briefly introduce themselves. We have 2 in the first slot, and then it will be an open floor where I'll try to go on a fairly strict basis of first hand up will be the next question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good afternoon. I've also played football for many years, some years ago now. I will share this first presentation with my friend and partner in crime, Andreas Celios, in Norway. We have been done a lot of work about FIFA and other stuff, IOC, for the last 7 or 8 years. Så skulle jeg lige have, where is this for the, yeah. Yeah. Old FIFA or new FIFA? Almost 30 years ago, Andrew Jennings was in Copenhagen. He had written a book about corruption within the IOC, and I had the opportunity to interview him. When we were about to finish, I asked him, what is the next project? What are you going to do now? And he thought about taking a closer look at the FIFA. He wasn't interested in football, but he heard something about corruption among the fine gentlemen of the Football Federation. Since then, I have been in touch with Andrew Jennings. I followed his first revelations of the condition in FIFA, and along the way, he worked for our newspaper on several occasions, making a number of international revelations. And as you can see, always dressed in the newspaper's very adorable t-shirts. He also covered the election of Sepp Blatter as president of FIFA in 1998 for Ekstrabladet. Andrew was one of the first journalists to get a serious hold of FIFA, which was not without reason called MaFIFA amongst journalists. Many thought that it all culminated when the Swiss police stormed Berlac in Zurich in May 4 years ago. I was in Zurich myself that day and was part of the international journalist corps who ran from hotel to hotel following the fall of FIFA and Sepp Blatter. But the storm at Berlac was not the end of the corrupt FIFA. There are many who, after May 2015, have tried to distinguish between the old FIFA and the new FIFA. It is especially an exercise that Gianni Infantino and his cast of coaches and cardinals have tried to expose to us. It is said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I don't have that much time today, so I'll try to depict the difference between old FIFA and new FIFA with images. This is old FIFA, new FIFA. 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 Oh, what a picture. Yeah, as you can see, the only real difference is in the age. But kindly allow me to use a few words to explain why I think one can question the credibility of FIFA's reforms and whether FIFA and Gianni Infantino are instruments of dubious interest. The best example of both is the story of the $25 billion, a secret consortium, and 2 new tournaments, a new Club World Cup and a new national team tournament. Throughout most of the last year, Infantino tried to force the 2 new tournaments to FIFA's council, but he would not tell who would pay the 25 billion and what impact the secret investors should have. The threat was that unless the council clicked their heels and said yes, the offer would fail for a deadline. It was pure mafia methods, just like in the good old days. forgotten well the many fine speeches about the new FIFA with openness and transparency. Unfortunately, there were strong forces in FIFA's council which put its foot down this time and stopped Infantino's plans. Dissatisfaction spread with FIFA's partners and among the member states. Adidas has been a sponsor of FIFA for decades. In December last year, Adidas CEO, the Dane Kasper Rørsted, sent a letter to FIFA complaining about the lack of communication about the new tournaments. This is evidenced by this internal mail from FIFA's headquarters at FIFA Straße in Zurich, and I apologize for the poor picture quality. In a new internal mail from FIFA dated December 20, FIFA's acting Secretary General Alistair Bell reflects on the letter from Kasper Rørsted. Again, I apologize for the image quality, but it is interesting that Alistair Bell has been talking about bribery for many years, and that Adidas has a contract with FIFA until 2030, a contract where FIFA's Secretary General apparently cannot fully understand the content of it. Alistair Bell is a lawyer, so is Gianni Infantino. The UEFA President Alexander Seferin is also a lawyer, and no joke, the President of the Danish FA, Jesper Møller, is also a lawyer. But there are, of course, good lawyers and bad lawyers. But incidentally, Jesper Møller was another who responded to Infantino's secrecy regarding the 25 billion and the secret investors. Earlier this year, the Danish FA chose to give Infantino the cold shoulder when he thought re-election as president of FIFA. In January at a meeting in Morocco, Infantino announced that he had support statement from 195 of FIFA's 211 member countries. Among the countries that had not signed were Denmark and the other Nordic countries. We disagree about the new tournament, and we think we need more information, Jesper Møller explained to Ekstra Bladet. So old FIFA or new FIFA, same in many ways. And then I will leave the floor to Andreas.
Thank you. We saw a lot of good, nice pictures there on old FIFA and new FIFA, and there is a big difference between the old FIFA and the new FIFA, and I will try to describe this to you by using some examples that I've been involved in, some cases that I've been involved into. And what we try to describe is that old FIFA was a decentralized, corrupt organization with a president that knew that the organization was corrupt, but the corruption was good for him, so as long as they did their business there, he would get re-elected. If he had problems, he just increased the number of member states, member federations, and also promised them some money. But also at the same time, Sepp Blatter, Avalanche, they had a kind of idea how to develop football. The new FIFA is much more centralized organization, corrupt, could be, with a president that is hands-on on who's going to be elected, and at the same time are being used by powerful states to do what they want you to do. And that is what some refer to as sports washing. I will take you to through some cases that I've been working with. I've been working with, for instance, a Norwegian magazine called Josimar. And in 2016, we found out, at least we think we found out, how Alexander Seferin of UEFA was elected president and how this happened. This is a picture of the former Secretary General of the Norwegian Football Federation. In 2000, he was the Secretary General until 2016, and then Infantino hired him as a special advisor to FIFA. In between the ending of Secretary General and starting as a special advisor, he went to a secret meeting before the Champions League game in Milan. The Champions League game was between Atletico Madrid and Real Madrid. And he told the Nordic presidents in this secret meeting that they should vote for Ceferin. Ceferin, the Slovene, was not even a candidate at that point, and also Ceferin was inside that room. And he did this, maybe not ordered to do this by Infantino, but with Infantino's knowledge. Infantino wanted Ceferin to be elected, and he did a lot of background work and lobbyism to get nations to support Ceferin, even if they did not know who Ceferin was. And it was very convenient for Ceferin that the Nordic countries was the first countries that supported Ceferin before Russia, who also wanted him elected, to support him first because of all the troubles we have been discussing now for 2-3 days here. So he was very hands-on. He wanted him to be elected, and he used middlemen to convince federations to elect Ceferin. Maybe he will regret that today, because they are the biggest enemies in international football now is Ceferin and Infantino. Which button? No? Okay. This is the president of CAF, the African Confederation, Ahmed from Madagascar. He was also elected as a president by surprise, and he is also Infantino's man. Infantino worked very hard to get him elected, and that also caused him problems afterwards. I will tell you a little bit later. But he was a man coming from fishery in Madagascar, very little experience in football, but was suddenly elected as a president in CAF. And Infantino used the newly elected Secretary General, Fatma Samoura, from Senegal, who had been working in Madagascar for many years in the UN system and knew Ahmed very well. So she was the person who took over the job of Jérôme Valcke, and she has been very, very active in having a good relationship with Ahmed and being a kind of coordinator between these two. Here they sit together with, how to put it, family members and not family members. Ahmed is sitting in the middle, and Fatma Samoura is sitting here on the left. They have a nice conversation after the AFCON in Cairo in 2017, as far as I remember. Here they are discussing things, and I have a very familiar, in a very familiar setting. Here you have the picture of Infantino at the FIFA Congress in Paris this year. Here he says that what is good with me as a president after 3 years and why you should elect me, he had no opponents, is because we never talk about corruption in FIFA longer. He says that we never talk about corruption in FIFA any longer. And the day after, Ahmed, the president, was arrested for and accused of corruption. And what they was accused of, for instance, was that they had given an equipment deal to a company that had not very much experience with providing equipment to national teams from before. I think they dealt with swimming equipment and things like that, but had no involvement in football equipment before. They did not want to use Puma. They had an offer. Adidas did not want to provide the tactical, I don't remember their name right now, tactical steel. And they asked Adidas if they could provide any equipment. but it was a short notice, but still they managed to get hold of 12,000 football balls and a lot of equipment with Adidas stamps and the FIFA logo. And we don't know if FIFA approved this or not. So this is a corruption case that is still going on. But what happened was that they did not remove Ahmed. What they did was they sent Fatma Samoura to Africa to solve the problem there, the good friend of Ahmed. So this is the last slide. This is the hotel where UEFA and CAF stayed during the FIFA Congress. It was the same hotel. That was a hotel, some of my colleagues, we sat, at least tried to sit in the lobby there all day to get in touch with people and see what went on. But when they saw that me and some colleagues from Josimar and other news outlets, when they saw that we were approaching the hotel, they told the security guards to stop us and don't let us in, because they were afraid that we would write something bad. And we did, or my colleagues did, because this tactical steel corruption deal and other deals, some of my colleagues have been working with for almost 2 years. And they were in a big fight, legal fight with the PR company and the lawyers of CAF, Tactical Steel and others. And they did not dare to publish these documents or the stories because the legal consequences could be very severe. So what some of my colleagues did was they went to the police and gave them some information about what they were doing, and then the police could go out with the story and arrest people. And then my colleagues can write their stories, because the lawyers and the PR companies had much more to do now than before. So the arrest and the investigation was very much helped by the journalists' work, both with the police and also their ethics standards when it comes to journalists. So the last picture here. I should be a little bit careful now, but because in these Trump and Putin investigations, you mentioned the one special kind of shower. I don't know if it's this kind of shower, but this is an illustration that Infantino, who got an award by Vladimir Putin after the World Cup, is very good friends with state leaders that want to use football as a tool in their politics and not for the development of football. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Can I invite Bonita to the stage?
Thanks, Mike. We were supposed to give a brief introduction. First and foremost, my life, I'm a football fan and have been since I was that high. Played the game very amateurly, and I've been a volunteer for the past 35 years of my life, since my kids were little. So, plus all the other stuff as well that I talked about last night. I want to preface my comments by saying when I refer to FIFA, I'm generally referring to World Football Administration, not just those people in Zurich, but more broadly. And I'm not talking about the staff, who by and large, are really good professional people. But the football politicians who run FIFA, the 6 football confederations, the 211 member associations, and the people who are in the president's inner circle. Those of us who were at Play the Game 4 years ago will remember being riveted by the presentation of a person who called himself, I'm not sure that it was his name, but he called himself Special Agent Nicholas Chaviron of the Criminal Investigations Unit of the FBI. The aspect of what he said that stuck in my mind the most was a diagram he showed where he compared the mafia with FIFA, and how in a mafia-style organisation as FIFA was deemed to be, and first named by the great Andrew Jennings as such, everyone has their role to play. When one person departs, another person simply takes over their role. The textbook example of this, of course, is the Brazilian Football Confederation, where we had João Havelange, Ricardo Teixeira, José Maria Marin, and Marco Polo De Niro all indicted. Of course, CONCACAF is another textbook example, with Jack Warner, Alfredo Howitt, Lyle Austin and Jeffrey Webb, all indicted. Oceania has been questionable since the days of Charlie Dempsey, leaving Zurich ahead of the vote for the 2006 World Cup, which we now know was won corruptly by Germany. Dempsey's acting successor spent his brief time in charge really well, building a new house for himself on top of a hill in the Pacific with a FIFA grant. Dempsey's eventual successor, Reynald Tomari, touted for funds during the 2018-2022 bidding process. Just remember, I was in the room when he did it, and has been banned by FIFA twice. His successor, David Chung, was fined 100,000 Swiss francs for corruption earlier this year and was banned by FIFA for 6.5 years. And then there is the new CEO of Oceania, who replaced the banned former CEO, none other than Tomari's right-hand man, who was with him at almost every meeting related to 2018-2022, Frank Castillo. Are you keeping up? And then we have Asia. Mohammed bin Haman's successor, Sheikh Salman of Bahrain, is backed by a man alleged by some to be one of the most notorious in world sport, Sheikh Ahmed Al Sabah of Kuwait. Otherwise known, I believe, if you read the indictments, which Jens Weinreich referenced yesterday, as co-conspirator number 2 in the US Department of Justice second stage of indictments. Al Sabah has resigned from his official football positions, but he hasn't really, because he's still behind the scenes with the Asian Football Confederation. Earlier this year, he was lobbying actively for election of the new AFC executive, with voters shown a list of who they should vote for or else. The names on that list were precisely those people who were elected, and I'm ashamed and embarrassed to say that the Australian person was one of them. Let's not forget also the possibility of Sheikh Salman winning the FIFA election against Gianni Infantino in 2016. It was enough to supposedly potentially risk FIFA's victim status with both the US and the Swiss authorities. While Salman didn't win the FIFA election, however, he's been re-elected unopposed in the Asian Football Confederation. But if he was not the right person for FIFA, why is he the right person to run Asian football? What FIFA President Gianni Infantino and CEO Fatma Samura have done is introduce some process and put a friendlier, more contemporary gloss over what they do and how they do it. On the face of it, they've ticked a lot of boxes, and this is some of them, for which they must get some credit. All of this activity culminates annually in an enormous activity report, which, just like bid books, no one actually reads, but the pictures look great. And that probably sums up the current administration as well as anything. It is more about sizzle than substance and more about process than culture. It is by and large a PR exercise masterminded by the global consulting firm Teneo. And as I have said many times, when it comes to a competition between process and culture, culture wins every time. I'm just going to give 3 examples of how things have not really changed at all. There are many, many more I could have picked. The first is a human rights policy. The reason we have a human rights policy from FIFA in the first place was because of Qatar, its kafala system and its workers' rights practices. It took more than 5 years of campaigning by a significant number of people and organisations united for that cause. Only last week, human rights campaigners and media demonstrated that hundreds of migrant workers are continuing to die as a result of the Doha heat as they build World Cup infrastructure. Earlier this year, Australian refugee semi-pro footballer from Bahrain, Hakeem Al-Arabi, was freed from a Thai jail, not thanks to official football threatening sanctions on either Thailand or Bahrain, but the efforts of Brendan Schwab and Craig Foster and the Australian government. But the aspect of human rights policy I want to focus on is related to the World Cup qualifier last week between Iran and Cambodia in Iran. As you may be aware, Iran has had a ban on women entering stadiums for the past 40 years. Last week, under pressure, 4,000 women were permitted into the game. A few weeks ago, a young fan, Sahari Kadiyari, tragically died as a consequence of that ban. 4,000 women being allowed into a game in a stadium that takes 90,000 people is not a cause for celebration. That's not a lifting of a ban. It's a patronising pat on the head, the sort of one that women have been getting for many decades. 18 months ago, the FIFA president was in the Azadi Stadium watching a match while 35 women were outside and arrested as they tried to enter. Iranian activist Mariam Shojeh, who is the sister of the Iranian captain, has highlighted that the Iran FA will not provide restrooms for women in other stadiums because they supposedly can't afford to. But if Iran can't afford to, why doesn't FIFA use some of their reserves, or the AFC, or, dare I say, their friends in Qatar? It really isn't that difficult. The 40-year ban contravenes Articles 3 and 4 of the FIFA statutes. FIFA's human rights policy has been in place since 2016. FIFA and the Iran FA have had more than enough time to get this right, but FIFA continues to hand out extensions of time for the Iran FA to do something about it and agree to condescending half measures such as 4,000 tickets. Once again, they tick a box, they take a picture, and it's sizzle over substance. The second is the number of personnel involved in the areas of governance, compliance and ethics. This is straight out of the Blatter playbook, and Professor Maduro will no doubt speak more. But what's the difference between the turnover of people in the Blatter era and the turnover of people now? Remember Judge Gunther Hirsch from the German High Court? He left his role as head of the Ethics Committee in January 2011 saying, quote, FIFA had no interest in tackling corruption. No matter, a few months later, if you recall, Blatter announced a good governance committee comprising, of all people, especially now, Placido Domingo, Henry Kissinger, the late Johann Cruyff and Louis Freeh. Needless to say, that didn't get off the ground. Professor Mark Peace left in frustration, saying that FIFA wasn't capable of reforming itself, as did a member of his committee, Alexandra Raji. Even the well-remunerated Michael Garcia left, saying the same thing. Since Infantino came to power, we've had the likes of Cornel Borbeli, Judge Eckert, Domenico Scala and Professor Maduro all ousted effectively without cause. And, as Andreas has referred to, with Infantino convincing the FIFA Council to give him unprecedented power, even more than Blatter, to have those committees handpicked and answer to him rather than being truly independent. The third issue I want to highlight relates to the unstated deals that help secure major events, which of course goes to the heart of transparency. In my book, I reveal that the former CEO of FIFA, Jerome Valcke, actually told us, Australia, in July 2009, that we would not win the World Cup. It's to our shame that we kept going with it, but that's another issue. The reason he gave that we wouldn't win it was because we would not be competitive commercially with the United States, which was supposed to win 2022. I actually had no problem with him telling us this. Valcke would also have told Qatar the same thing. The difference is Qatar dealt with it by offering a $100 million payment to FIFA if the 2022 World Cup was held in Qatar. That deal was negotiated in October 2010, before the vote, and signed off within a few days of the vote. beIN Sports and Nasser Al-Khelaifi's lawyers call it, quote, a production contribution. Some might call it a bonus, others might have another name for it. There is no doubt, however, that whatever you call it, it meant that FIFA would not be disadvantaged commercially with the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Fast forward to the contest this year, and now Americans can start wriggling in their seats, between the combined bid of the United States, Canada and Mexico versus Morocco for the 2026 World Cup. Many people wondered in the lead up to the vote just why Gianni Infantino and Fatma Samura were so obviously advocating for the 2026 bid. No doubt it was a strong bid and it'll be a great World Cup. But could the real reason for the advocacy be that the US, Mexico and Canadian broadcasters will also provide a similar bonus payment, thereby increasing Infantino's war chest even more? From the two US networks involved alone, one of which is Fox, that bonus is $295 million. What FIFA and beIN Sports will tell you is that a production contribution is a standard clause. But it wasn't until the very first one in 2010 between FIFA and beIN Sports. And Infantino is more than happy to have the same arrangement in place for 2026 as it helps increase his war chest for development funds. Is the fact that FIFA is trying to maximise their revenue a bad thing? Of course not, if it's done for the right reasons and if everyone knows about it. What does matter is that maximising revenue isn't stated up front as part of the bidding criteria, and that there is no transparency around that being important, if not critical factor, in the decision around who will host a World Cup. By the way, talking of the same, the person who was in charge of the United 2026 bid also worked on the 2022 bid for the US. But immediately prior to that, he worked for Infront Sports. Before that, he was with Kirsch Sport, and before that, he was with ISL. Of course, that is not to say that he was involved with any of the illegal activities of Kirsch or ISL, but you could hardly work there and not have some insight into the symbiotic relationship between FIFA and their broadcasting and marketing partners. And this, of course, leads us to the issue of culture. Back in 2010, when I first uttered the words, FIFA is incapable of reforming itself, I explained that it was because of its culture, which I described as the FIFA way. In part, that culture has grown up around world football as largely a consequence of the nature of the organisation, which I touched on last night. Individuals drawn from 211 countries with diverse backgrounds, expertise and motivations for being there. Many of these individuals started off on their journey in football as a volunteer, like Chuck Plazer, a player, such as Franz Beckenbauer, or a prince, such as Sheikh Salman. In that capacity, they suddenly have a fancy title of Mr. President. They are flown to exotic places around the world in the pointy end of aircraft, staying at 5-star or better hotels with generous daily allowances. They have access to the best seats in the house at any football match they want to attend, with lobster and champagne before and after the match. I know that because I've actually been in one of those areas. They are treated like VIPs and even VVIPs. They are given expensive gifts which they don't declare, and some come from countries that may not have the same governance standards that your country or mine would normally tolerate. As I mentioned last night, FIFA sets governance standards at the level of the lowest common denominator because it suits the FIFA way of doing business, and they continue to do so. Unless and until the culture is addressed, things will not properly change at FIFA. The only way to do that, I believe, is something I've long advocated, basically to blow it all up and start again. FIFA will never properly address culture in itself, as the FIFA way is entrenched and everyone has their role to play, as the FBI special agent told us 4 years ago. It truly is a case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Thank you.
So thank you very much to Play the Game for the invitation to be here and the opportunity to talk to you about my experience, my brief experience at FIFA. When I was invited to be the chair of what was the new governance and review committee of FIFA, at that time my relation with football was only that of a passionate fan. I had played football, I loved football, but I had never had any involvement in the world of football, and particularly in its organizations and its governance. After that brief experience that lasted less than a year, an experience where, together with my colleagues, the great majority of which left the committee at that moment too that I left, we tried to reform a variety of aspects. We tried to introduce genuine controls of integrity on eligibility and admissibility. We tried to fight what is blatant cases of discrimination against women that continue to exist, whereby, for example, a rule that was created with the reform process of 2015 that establishes that confederations have to elect at least one woman has been transformed into a rule in many confederations, where confederations cannot elect more than one woman. So it's extraordinary that a rule aimed at favoring female representation is actually used to discriminate against women. We tried in many aspects to reform FIFA, to make use of the limited powers that we had, but we were ultimately unsuccessful. We did some things, we prevented some people, at least, from getting into some positions. But I fear that even the few that we have achieved will soon be reverted. My overall conclusion of my experience at FIFA, and also of what has remained since then my academic interest in FIFA and my policy interest in FIFA, whereby I now pay much more attention as an object of my study, but also as an object of my policy activities, of my civic activities, to what can be done to reform FIFA and football. My conclusion, as I was saying, is that FIFA is not reformable from within, cannot reform itself. We absolutely agree on the same conclusion. Let me tell you, and that was what I'm going to try to explain, why that is so. I think we all recognize today, and public opinion, that there's widespread problems in football, from money laundering to corruption, to an increased competitive gap, to generalized conflict of interests, to political interference, to discrimination, to human rights abuse. My first thesis is that what explains these problems and what it renders so difficult to fight these problems is a particular culture of governance. It's a culture of governance that, to some extent, metaphorically I define of that of an organization that was initially developed as an amateur organization that has now become a multi-million-dollar organization in an area that is perhaps the area of greatest social interest in the leisure domain, and that in economic terms, just in the European Union, for example, represents, according to a study of the European Commission, 3.7% of the European Union GDP, more than twice the amount of agriculture impact in the EU GDP. But this area is subject to a private form of governance with a culture of governance that is basically dominated by two fundamental problems. The first, it is its lack of representation and democratic character, albeit it makes that claim, that is part of the claim to actually argue in terms of self-governance and self-regulation. But in fact, it is dominated by a political cartel with a very high concentration of power. And second, this power is then not subject to any effective mechanism of checks and balances, any effective mechanism of independent scrutiny. Now, the problem is that these two fundamental flaws in the governance culture of FIFA, and that require reform, are the same reasons that make reform impossible. And this is what I will try to explain. And I will conclude by also trying to explain how can then reform be promoted? What can we do to try to promote reform? So let me start with the question of political cartel. Think about this and try to make a parallel with any state. President Avalanche was president of FIFA for 24 years. He was replaced by his number two, Mrs. Sepp Blatter, that was president of FIFA for 17 years and ended up living in the conditions that we all know, having just been re-elected recently when he left. So he would, in principle, have stayed even more. He is now replaced by Infantino, that even if he presents himself as a different person, is still, to a large extent, a fruit of the same tree, shares the same culture, comes from the same background, and that was elected, just recently re-elected, unopposed. Something that is common, actually, not only in football, but in a lot of sports associations. Think about this reality, 24 years, 17 years, running unopposed, contested, by acclamation, by the way, in my view, in violation of the rule that requires confidentiality, and for a reason, because it was actually one of the conflicts, one of the many conflicts we had with some confederations, is that there is this practice, allow me the parenthesis, there is this practice of saying when there's only one candidate, we can elect by acclamation, even if the rule says secret ballot. And I told them, that's not so, because the rule requires a majority of votes in favor. And the secret ballot is there because it's possible that even if you have a single candidate, that candidate doesn't have a majority of votes in favor. You can have more than 50% abstention, and they're not elected. The reason why they don't do that, because it's a way of controlling the vote. They know that no one dares to come forward and challenge the candidate that has been defined by the political cartel as the candidate everybody accepts. And then by voting by acclamation, they don't risk any surprise result. And in fact, they violate what is a rule. And it was the same thing with Mr. Infantino. And if you look at votings at FIFA, they are remarkable, or even in the confederations, almost always unanimous. Any dictator will be embarrassed by the lack of support that the dictator gets normally in terms of votes if compared with any election in the world of football. I've asked someone to look, for example, at the confederations. In 50 years of elections and confederations, that person told me that he had found only once that a sitting president, had been defeated, when Mr. Johansson lost to Mr. Platini. Now, if in any other regime, if we look at reality like this, we would assume there is a problem here. There must be a problem here. Such low level of turn in terms of the positions of powers, no contestation, there must be a problem. And the problem that exists is that political cartel. Now, what explains that political cartel? Let me present you a set of variables that, in my view, it's what leads to that political cartel. First, no diversity of representation. The electoral body is itself, to a large extent, a closed constituency, made of the same people, or the sons, not the daughters, the sons, or those that are produced by the original set of people to a large extent. It's a closed constituency, and without opening up to the representation of women, not only in the positions elected, it's the electoral body that is important in the first place. Because even if you impose a rule that they have to elect women, the women then that are elected by the same circle of men as always. So what you need to change is the electoral body, who votes, who determines who gets elected. And you need to exponentially increase that. At this moment, what you have is a closed constituency of people, the same people of always. Then second thing, you have a mixture of fragmentation, because each association has only one vote, including micro associations, very small associations that can very easily be captured, with low numbers that can therefore be very easily aggregated, captured, and turned into voting syndicates. So this conjugation of fragmentation on the one hand, each association with one vote, with a low number of votes, allows for a very easy control of the vote. Third, concentration of money takes place at the level of confederations and FIFA, and this concentration of money becomes concentration of power that then attributes to the presidents of FIFA and the confederations basically the right to choose who is in power, including at the level of football associations. You just gave the example of what happens with the confederations, of the influence that a president of FIFA, with the money that they have and the power that they have to distribute it, has to reward those that are loyal, in inverted commas, versus penalizing those that are critical, and therefore choosing the persons that stay in power. The entire narrative of FIFA and football in terms of self-government is a bottom-up narrative. We represent football, and therefore we are allowed to self-govern ourselves. In reality, the way it works is top-down, is not bottom-up. Is where the money gets concentration by the media rights, by the big events, FIFA and the confederations, that then they have this huge amount of money that they use to consolidate power and to put their loyal people in positions of power. And finally, the electoral process itself helps to consolidate this political cartel and the way it works. Now, we tried to change rules, for example, on guaranteeing the integrity of the ballots. I'm not even sure if those rules that we put in place are still being enforced or not, but we did try to do that. But that would only guarantee some integrity of the ballot, but will not guarantee the politics of it and the power organization of it. That leads that even sometimes you don't even have candidates putting for and competing for positions. Second aspect, another aspect that we were preparing and had a group that was working on rules, but of course it disappeared when we left, is campaign and funding. No one talks about that. To be a president of FIFA, it costs minimum, if you make a clean campaign, that is if you don't buy votes by paying money, it costs at least 2 million euros. Travel all around the world, meet all the people. Who pays for this? And who are the people that are funding this getting in return by funding certain candidates? We do not know about this. No one discusses this. It's not possible to be president of FIFA without spending a few millions. And we do not know where this money comes from and who is supporting these different candidates. This is a crucial aspect, one aspect my committee was trying to address when we had to leave. Now, it is now the convergence of those variables that leads to the formation of that political cartel that has been in power for a long period of time, and then to a very high concentration of power. But then the second fundamental problem is that this power is not subject to any appropriate or effective mechanism of independent scrutiny of checks and balances. We have a concentration of political, executive, and the administrative branches within FIFA. Congress is no check for anything for the reasons that I've said, but also the absence of truly independent bodies. They are portrayed as independent. Again, is this window dressing exercise that was mentioned before. But the reality is that the conditions for the independence of those bodies are not safeguarded. And I know what I'm talking about. Let me give you some examples of why that independence is not genuine. And by the way, this is the one crucial aspect, the second crucial aspect. Because without independent enforcement of the rules, then you don't have the rule of law. Everybody knows, and FIFA always says at the time, oh, we've banned these people. We've applied this rule there. But the problem is that the rules are applied selectively. This is the fundamental problem. Of course, some people are banned when they are not anyone that is worthy of protection by the president or the leaders of FIFA. If you try to ban someone that they like, then it becomes a problem. This is the definition of the absence of the rule of law. I always say FIFA is a rule by law, but not under the rule of law. And the crucial aspect is because the rules are not enforced by genuinely independent bodies. Why they are not generally independent? Well, they are subject to the political will of those that they are supposed to control and supervise. You can be fired, or you have renewable terms, and therefore you know that if you don't do or you don't act the way they like, that you will be replaced. There are no cooling off periods, for example. The independence of many of the members, so-called independent members, is very doubtful. There was this rule that they were supposed not to have a tradition of working in the system that has been overturned to a large extent by appointing people that come, for example, from clubs. So they've sidestepped the rule to a large extent. And there are many bodies, even including ethics bodies, where you have people from the football associations that are appointed, and the rules allow this. The organization of these bodies is itself not fully independent. They cannot hire their own staff most of the time, so they're dependent on staff that is made available to them by the administration. There's in a variety of ways where this makes impossible the genuine independence of these bodies. Let me conclude with why and how can we try to promote reform. First, for the reasons that I said, reform will not happen from within. First, no cartel by definition opens itself to competition. So we cannot expect the political cartel to be themselves defining, opening up to others, and, for example, changing the electoral body. And you cannot expect those that should be subject to scrutiny and independent control to subject themselves voluntarily to that independent control. They're not going to do it. So we'll have to come from the outside. And to come from the outside, you cannot expect it to come from individual states. Why? Because for one simple reason, no state has authority over a transnational body as FIFA, because FIFA can very easily blackmailed that state by excluding its teams from the competitions. The only time that FIFA accepted the jurisdiction of a judicial body effectively was the European Court of Justice. Think about that. What's the reason? Because they cannot say that if the European Court of Justice, as it was the case in the famous Bosman decision, will decide against their rules, they will not comply and they will exclude Spain, Germany, France, Italy, and all those states. So this needs to be a transnational effort in terms of control. How can it be? First, we are increasingly, and if you wanted the discussion, we can talk about that, we are seeing increasingly moves from courts, including supranational courts like the European Court of Human Rights, that are ready to scrutinize the decisions of these institutions. There's a very recent decision of the European Court of Human Rights that does not have enough attention, that opens the door to review the decisions of sports associations that are not compatible with the European Convention. And together with that, what you need then is to try to set up either an international organization, what I think very unlikely, or in my view, only the European Union can effectively intervene, either by creating an agency, either by using competition law, or by creating a form of licensing system. Thank you very much.
Okay, if I can invite our last speaker.
All right. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. You're wondering why I'm here? I can explain. So I can give, it'll be slightly different it'll be slightly different than what you've heard. I can give you the insider experience because I most recently worked as FIFA as the first chief compliance officer up until about July of this year when I returned to the United States. I'm a partner at a law firm now in the US where I focus on ethics and compliance for sports, media, entertainment organizations. So I can tell you about my experience at FIFA, I can tell you about what I experienced when I started, and then what we built over a 3-year period of time. You can take it or leave it. So I will, the green one, here we go. So this is littered with pictures from FIFA's website, and then pictures I took of my son running around FIFA's campus. So it'll be a little bit lighter. So what is FIFA? And I've done a few of these presentations before, and I like to describe FIFA to audiences because sometimes people think they know what FIFA is, they don't quite understand what FIFA is. So my son loved the football pitch next to FIFA, so he always, anytime I took him to the office, he made a run for the soccer pitch, the football pitch. But FIFA, the name of FIFA is Fédération Internationale de Football Association. So it's an association of football associations. So there's 211 members. It's larger than the United Nations. I won't doubt it's a highly political organization because you have many different views and organizations who are very interested in the outcome of football and the outcome of FIFA. There's me with my boss. So I was appointed by Fatima and Johnny, so they hired me. I am also a lawyer. FIFA was stuffed, especially the management team. We were stuffed with lawyers. I was the only American lawyer on the management team. I'm also a football outsider. I'm a sports outsider. I came from pharmaceuticals. I was general counsel at a pharmaceutical company before I was hired by FIFA. I actually was approached by FIFA, so I never applied for this job. FIFA had a headhunter contact me. I was in Singapore at the time, where I was head of legal and compliance for a Japanese pharma company called Takeda, which is one of the larger pharmaceutical companies in the world. I was responsible for emerging markets, specifically focusing on compliance. Previous to that, I was general counsel and head of compliance for Novo Nordisk for the emerging markets division, which is a giant Danish pharmaceutical company. And prior to that, I was a private practice lawyer in the United States, where I represented pharmaceutical companies as a trial lawyer, defending them in mass tort. So you might wonder, how do I fit in to the picture? And the summary of it is FIFA knew they had an issue with how to build a structure internally that was going to be able to try to, you could say, support the professionalization of FIFA. So they figured the only way to solve that was to look for someone who'd either worked in a highly regulated industry or was coming from the type of business where you are highly regulated. So naturally what came to mind was banking or pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals is ultimately what they selected. I was appointed in August 2016. So Miguel and I overlapped he actually went through one of my compliance trainings, so he's seen it. So before I took the job at FIFA, I had some discussions with the management team about the things that I thought I would need and the commitments I would need to have before I took on the position. Because I was apprehensive. Coming from pharmaceutical, I had senior positions, I had a reputation. I figured, okay, I know football, I know soccer. I played lacrosse in college. I never played soccer in college, but like every American boy, I played soccer up until about age 10. But I said, I need a commitment that you're not just going to hire one person for the compliance team, meaning me, because I've seen this happen before. I need a commitment that whatever I ask for from a budget standpoint, I will get. That whatever I ask for from a resource standpoint, I will get. And that my reporting lines, which to Fatima, and then also to the Audit and Compliance Committee, which was one of the independent committees, and also I have, you could say, a dotted line to Johnny, because I took monthly meetings with Johnny, that would stay in place. And Fatima said, yes, you will get that. So I can tell you, when I left this summer, I think we had 14 people on the compliance team. So there's 800 employees at FIFA. So that's a pretty high percentage of a staff that's in compliance. I mean, I can tell you, coming from pharmaceuticals, I would love, when I was working at my previous jobs, to have a percentage that high to help support compliance. And you might ask, well, in football, why do you need so much? Well, as an association, FIFA has an obligation to essentially redistribute the profits of its activities, which are the World Cup and the broadcast rights, to get them back out to the member associations. And that's a massive task. I mean, I don't know if anyone has any idea. I mean, maybe Miguel and others know how much FIFA distributes per year. Anyone?
2 billion.
Not per year. It's about 400 million, 450 million a year. So it's a challenging task for 800 people. I can tell you, I spent a lot of time, and my team, we spent a lot of time vetting and reviewing applications from the member associations on how they were going to spend the money. And then, how do you monitor? So for those of you who are familiar with compliance, so here, this just gives you an idea. This is the clear separation. So this is from FIFA's website. So this was part of the reform, was the goal to switch from the FIFA Exco, which everyone is familiar with, how the FIFA Exco worked in the past, to at least try to separate the political from the administrative. You know, people can always challenge how much the separation has occurred. You can see my position. I don't know if there's a laser pointer in here. My position's in there somewhere, Chief Compliance Officer, reporting to Fatima, and also the Audit and Compliance Committee. The Audit and Compliance Committee is interesting because each quarter we had an obligation to report how we were distributing the funds to the member associations and how we were monitoring those funds. So maybe I can start with this picture too. When you build a compliance, so for those of you who aren't familiar with compliance, so compliance is essentially how an organization attempts to comply with relevant laws and regulations. It sounds simple in concept. It's not so simple. Lawyers love it because it's not simple, and you can provide lots of advice to clients who need help in this space. But I use this Banksy picture. I'm sure people are familiar with this Banksy picture. And how everyone was surprised at the auction house that Banksy did this. But I would question if Sotheby's or whoever had a good compliance program, they would have done their due diligence, and they would have looked at this painting, and they might have realized it seems a bit odd that it's this heavy for a painting from Banksy, an artist who's notorious for doing stunts. So I use this. You have to learn from the past when you're building a compliance program. So one of the first things I did was said you have to follow money into an organization and you follow money out of an organization. So that's how we built the compliance program. We looked at how are we getting the money from broadcasting, how are we getting money from ticketing, from all the revenue sources, how is that managed, and then how is that money redistributed to the member associations. It seems simple, but it's extremely challenging when you have 211 member associations in some parts of the world that even Big Four don't operate in. So every year, the statutes say we need to, or FIFA, since I'm not there anymore, you would need to audit 20% of the expenditures every year you need to audit. So the first year I was there, so 20% of 211, you could do the math, it's 40, give or take. First year I was there, I said, let's double that to 80, with the goal of being, let's get up to 200, because let's have an audit cycle that's every year, every 2 years at best. So at least we can figure out what the issue is. Because if you're doing 20%, it doesn't take a math genius to figure out it's a 5-year cycle. So you're actually exceeding a presidential cycle and you're exceeding a revenue cycle. It doesn't make sense. So we started auditing the finances every single year. And I can tell you it was a shock to a lot of the member associations when we would show up, and we would show up a big four, and we would start going through all the books and records. How are you managing this? How are you managing that? And one of the key reforms is you had to actually implement, this is the governance report we publish every year. So this was also something we changed. We started to be much more transparent in everything we were doing. But we wanted the organizations to understand, how are you spending the money? Because you don't need to rely on FIFA to have to come in every single year to say, this is how you need to spend money. We wanted them to know, this is how you organize your project. This is how you see your project through to the end. We're going to vet it at the beginning, and we're going to vet it at the end. And there are some investigations, I'm not here to disclose all the investigations we took, but some were reported in the New York Times, and some involved previous association presidents or confederation presidents, because we did go double check on where the money was going, and investigations were started as a result of that. And I can tell you, in my 3 years experience, not once was I told, don't look into that. Not once was I told, we're not going to give you the resources to look into that. In fact, what I was told was, if you think it's a good idea, do it. And I know people are going to be surprised to hear that, but I can only tell you my experience. This was my experience. Now, granted, from a compliance standpoint, I don't have oversight of all of global football. All we touched was FIFA and FIFA's funds, because that's all we had from a statutory standpoint. That's all we had control over. But that's what we focused on. And for those of you who are familiar with how corporations run compliance programs, this is exactly how you do it. You put a team together, you conduct a risk assessment, so you understand where's your risk. You implement policies, procedures, and controls. So some of our controls were monitoring how the funds were being spent. We developed training and communications. We trained the team. We trained FIFA. We started training the member associations. We developed a monitoring and auditing program. I just described that to you. We annually evaluated and improved the program. So the first year we looked at 80, the next year we looked at 120, and the following year, this year, we looked at 200. And then we report publicly and annually, which is the governance report. I can tell you, coming from Novo Nordisk, this took us 6 to 8 years to do. So in 3 years we did this at FIFA. And I can tell you, one of the reasons why we actually pulled it off is because we had the internal support. And now I understand FIFA is the most interesting organization in the world, because I came from companies where they invented insulin. That's one of those things where if you need it and you get it, you live. If you don't get it, you die. The media showed zero interest in what I was doing, not at all. Then I worked at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, where they were developing cancer treatments, which also were life-saving. The media provided zero interest whatsoever into what we were doing. As soon as I started working at FIFA, I had multiple requests for interviews, multiple requests for statements. People wanted me to speak at conferences left, right, and center. So for me, that was an early indication of what people view as an interesting part of their lives. Healthcare, football, yes. So for me, it was important that I say, I take the program I implemented at a pharma company, and I do the same thing at FIFA. So with that, my ultimate goal at FIFA was, this is my son, he also used to run to the goal always, so I got a good one where he scored, was to try to limit our own goals. Because the worst thing an organization can do is not have appropriate controls, so you're hurting yourself. You're always going to have external factors, you're always going to have member associations, you're always going to have people in football, around football, that are going to try to take advantage. So our job, my job when I was at FIFA, when we set up our controls, was to try to create controls that made that as difficult as possible. And if people were going to do it, we were going to find them as quick as we could and conduct an investigation. And I encourage you to search in the New York Times to see an investigation that came out, I would imagine about 2018, to ask yourself, is FIFA really interested in following up on these things? If they weren't, why would they have conducted this investigation? So thank you with that, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Well, thank you to all of the speakers. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. So it's clear that the messages you're putting out there have been seriously concerning. It's a sobering talk, though, isn't it? I mean, this work needs to be done from the various angles, whether journalistic or political or legal. I'm very pleased that you came toward the end of your talk, Howard, about some kind of balance, because all the way through these talks I'm thinking, if we did have a pharma company, I thought of the two examples you gave, if we did have a kind of similar exercise with the banking industry or the pharma industry, would we be hearing the same stories, and how differently might we react to them? So the agenda looks like issues around human rights, gender equity, who establishes governance modes, who audits those modes, who has jurisdiction over FIFA, what about the autonomy of sport, has it gone too far? And then this key one about, can you reform it? Because most of you actually talked about that key issue. And I always thought, in my naivety, that you just have to get in there. You have to be part of the game if you want to change the game. And at least 3 of you, I think, are saying, actually, that's the wrong solution. The solution is to start again. But that sounds to me like a blank sheet of paper, but I don't know how in the world of sport you start with a blank sheet of paper. I don't know if that's possible. So I want to invite the audience now to participate, but I want to tell you a joke first. It actually happened to me in Ireland, right? This did happen. My mother and father were Irish, and I was tracking down my father's family. And I got lost in the middle of rural Ireland, and there was a farmer there, and I pulled down the window and I said, "Excuse me, can you tell me where Luke McNamee lives? I know he's somewhere around here." And the guy actually said to me, "Well, you wouldn't want to start from here." But here is where we have to start from. So this issue of reform versus starting again is, I think, going to be, I hope, the critical part of this discussion. Okay, can I open the floor to questions? Thank you very much.
Hi, Chris Gaffney, New York University. Many of you have lived in Switzerland. Many of you have researched in Switzerland. Many of you know Swiss laws, but it seems like we don't talk about the Swiss that much and the role of Switzerland as a very unique place where banking, pharmaceuticals, and international sport all reside in relatively non-transparent, non-accessible, and very particular ways. And so I was wondering if the lawyers and the journalists and those who are familiar with the intricacies of sport in Switzerland could help uncover a little bit about the role of that funny little country in the middle of Europe in all of this.
Howard, I think you're first up there, if you don't mind.
Edward, me?
Yeah, I think with a legal background,
Okay.
I think you're probably best positioned, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, having lived in Switzerland, it's a beautiful place, I will say. And I think historically, FIFA actually was organized in France, and it moved to Switzerland in 1904. We're actually a little bit later than that, 1904. But I think it has something to do with the Swiss association laws, at least for associations for sports. And I think that's what Miguel was highlighting, that the sports or the structures are set up such that they're made for amateur organizations to be able to easily organize themselves. Pharmaceutical companies, I know because I was GC of a pharmaceutical company also in Switzerland, are organized in Switzerland because the tax code is very friendly to businesses, and it's very easy to hire international talent and get them to come and live in Switzerland, if we're honest. When you're looking for places in Europe to be able to hire people to get them to come and move, Switzerland is an easy place to recruit people to go and live. So at least from that standpoint, those are the two that I experienced. There's also this IFRS, without getting super technical, there's a public finance requirement on how you disclose your finances in Switzerland. It's like Starbucks in the United States, it's IFRS in Switzerland. FIFA actually adopted that standard in 2018. It wasn't required. So FIFA did it early. The CFO of FIFA, Thomas Payer, he's actually extremely good. He's also another outsider. He comes from Kuoni, which is one of the largest travel agencies in the world. He was the group chief financial officer there. He's also very sophisticated, so he's done a very good job of implementing some of the key controls that were needed. And I can just give you one simple example. I'm kind of going off on a tangent a little bit. In 2016, when we started, FIFA did not have SAP for finances. So people are talking about how much money is coming through the door at FIFA. So just now ask yourself, that was being managed on spreadsheets. So yeah, I mean, people are curling their lips. That's basically what Thomas and I said the first month we were there. We absolutely have to implement SAP so we can track all of the funding. And we implemented SAP in, I think it was 16 months. So for those of you who've ever done that, that's extreme, that's blazing fast. So again, it was an opportunity we saw, the door was open to try to implement a change that was going to at least increase accountability. Because if you know if you're keeping track of numbers on an Excel spreadsheet, it's going to be hard to keep track of where all of those numbers are going.
Okay, so that's...
So I took the Swiss question and I ran it up to SAP.
But that's a clear story of there is reform. So the idea that there is no reform or not possible reform sounds to me like it's too blanket. Maybe it's not big enough, maybe it's not quick enough, but there is reform. It is part of your answer. I'd like a journalistic response and then I'm back out to the floor.
I would also like to make a response to that too, and that's just one comment. Because your question, Chris, was about Switzerland itself, and let's remember that this was a country that didn't join the United Nations until 2002. There's no surprise to learn that all the consultants that we employed, who got $15 million of the $50 million of taxpayers' money, they all had Swiss bank accounts. Everyone associated with FIFA, and again I stress, I'm not talking about staff, I'm talking about the football politicians, they have Swiss bank accounts. And try and find out how hard it is to get information from the Swiss banking system. It's that simple. And having worked I worked for the Red Cross for many years, which is also based in Switzerland. And the articles of association that allow organisations like that to be in Switzerland, they're there for a reason.
Switzerland has always served, especially FIFA, very well. For many years there was the biggest corruption scandal, the ISL case. The Swiss police, the Swiss authorities did all they could not to name the people involved in this case. And also the new FIFA, we are still wondering why did the FBI do all this work in this new FIFA case, and what is happening in Switzerland? And we are still waiting for the Swiss police, the Swiss General Secretary, to find out what is going on in Switzerland. In the United States, a lot of people have been arrested and they have been jailed, but in Switzerland we're still waiting.
Can I just add a small?
Of course.
Yeah. I think you could rephrase the question. Can FIFA be reformed while being in Switzerland? And when Switzerland now have changed some of their laws, so it's a little bit more transparent, the federations have started to discuss if they should move from Switzerland and maybe Qatar, I don't know, to other states that are less transparent. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but at least you can start to think what the organizations are thinking.
That's a good point, thank you.
Hi, this is Simon Lichen, and at this point I would almost like to hear Miguel's answer to Chris's question, but I have two short questions for Andreas instead, and my two short questions are, how did Gianni Infantino find Alexander Ceferin and Ahmed to lead UEFA and CAF, and why did he choose them?
I don't know how we found them, but then you have to ask Infantino. I guess you will not get an honest answer. But what we saw was that he was campaigning for them, and it must be a reason for that. And I think more of us should ask the questions like you do now. Why did he support Ceferin? Could be because he wanted, that was in the strategy to avoid Platini coming back, I don't know. Ahmad, I don't know. Maybe it was because he wanted to get rid of the old structure in Africa, so he had more control over what happened there. I don't know. But we should find out why he chose them, and if it was his pick, or if it was other behind his back who told him to do this.
Miguel.
So on the Swiss question, first I don't resist to your own question, why haven't the public prosecution been investigating the cases as the American? Well, I don't resist this provocation. As we now found out, some of them have actually been occupying their time seeing matches in Russia at the invitation of FIFA. This is actually true. We now know. Some members of the Swiss public prosecution, this is a scandal well known in Switzerland, were actually invited with hotel pays, matches, tickets to matches paid to go and see the World Cup in Russia. This said, I think it is, I wouldn't say unfair, but it's simply wrong to think that the problem is Switzerland. Switzerland was chosen for a reason. It was said here, the laws that they have, that particularly the strong autonomy that they give, the secrecy that they give in other respects. But if Switzerland would start to tighten the regulatory control over FIFA, what will happen is very simple. They will choose another jurisdiction. They will move to a more friendly jurisdiction. So the problem will not be solved by Switzerland suddenly becoming more regulatory. That's why I say that you need a transnational organization that has the capacity, enforcement capacity over FIFA. No individual state will be able to do that. Just on the question of the Africa, I have to say this because almost no one has talked about that question. The appointment of Fata Samora is scandalous, is another example of the problems with governance. I mean, how can you appoint someone to a de facto position of being temporary president of the African Confederation without any legal basis? Think about that. Can you, in any country or in any regime, simply decide, okay, we decide that we appoint this woman, Secretary General of FIFA, to replace the president of the African Confederation that was democratically elected? If they think that CAF no longer complies with the elements that are necessary under the status to be recognized as a confederation for the purposes of FIFA, then they suspend CAF. And CAF will go to an electoral process and elect a new. It's not to appoint, it's unbelievable from a rule of law point of view that this can be done. And by the way, also generator of a conflict of interest. Fatma Samora, as Secretary General of FIFA, wrote to CAF, where she now oversees and rules, asking the football associations of CAF to grant FIFA the rights to negotiate all the football matches of the respective in Africa. I mean, this is a blatant conflict of interest, even because CAF has a competing interest, if nothing else, to centralize those rights with respect to FIFA. And it's the same person that is writing in both capacities. It's inconceivable. And this happens, and nothing, just as if it is the most normal thing of the world.
I heard from several of the panel members the emphasis on, well, nothing has really changed. Of course, except when Mr. Hanover showed us what he and his team have been working on. And in some way, I agree, nothing much has changed, and that therefore I would agree with Mr. Maduro that some really substantial efforts, extraordinary efforts beyond normal elections and so on would be needed to cause real change. But I think in the meantime, there are three ways in which I think there has been a change that makes it more important than before even to sort of perhaps be concerned about FIFA and have a watchful eye. I have heard so many comments to the effect that, Blatter is gone, now we can relax, things surely must be improving just by that fact. So in other words, a lot of people who otherwise would pay attention are losing a bit interest. Then there seems to be the sense from some comments that Infantino is a more modern autocrat and has more modern and sophisticated methods, and that also, of course, makes the situation more dangerous. And third, I think I heard someone saying that, implying that, well, before it probably was FIFA who had the upper hand vis-a-vis virtually all member countries. And now we have a situation where many member countries really have their thumb on FIFA and have power over FIFA. And I think that has increased risks. So I would like to get comments from some panel members on that.
Okay, I think certainly the second of those two looks like it's Jan and Andreas.
Could you repeat the question? I didn't get
The sense
Can we
that-
just go for the second one, yeah?
the sense that problems might be more difficult to detect under Infantino than under Blatter, where we often before saw clumsy or more obvious actions, and perhaps now more better concealed or sophisticated ones.
I think the phrase you used was modern autocrat.
It's a good question. I'm not sure I agree with you, because we have seen Infantino try to. I take some example. I can take two examples. The World Cup in Qatar, Infantino tried to go from the 32 teams to 48 teams in Qatar, and if it was possible, Qatar couldn't have the World Cup alone, and the plan from Infantino was to share the World Cup with Saudi Arabia and UAE. And then we will have another situation in the Gulf states, because how is the migrant workers betrayed in Saudi Arabia and in the other Gulf countries? Another thing is now we will have a new Club World Cup in 21. The council have decided that, FIFA's council, and they're meeting at the end of October in Shanghai, of course, in China. Then the press can't come there because it's very hard to get a visa to China in a short time. And who will get the World Cup in 21? The decision will be taken in Shanghai, and I don't know 100%, but I think it will go to China, the new Club World Cup. And so we will have again the problems with how do they manage the situation with the minority of Muslims and a lot of other things. And so I don't think Infantino is doing this very well, and I can't see the reforms in this. They're just two examples.
Yeah. I think if you implemented what you told us during Blatter time, I think Blatter would not last for 17 years. But what I tried to describe was that now it's forces outside FIFA who governs the football, like Jan said. Saudi Arabia are influential, other China will be influential, and then you can put up charts and strategies and things like that, and many will not care. In sports, you have two big animals. You have white elephants and paper tigers. And we have in sports we have to make a difference between output and outcome. What you told us is mostly is output. We have to see in maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years what the outcome of this will be. So it's hard to say, but this debate is similar to what we had with the IOC yesterday, because we talk about the new norm. The new norm is very good when we listen to IOC. But it's less transparent with the new norm than the Agenda 2020, and this can be the same case.
Do you want to come back, Howard?
Can I make a comment on that too? Because I think these are all great points. I mean, and as an insider, I mean, I went to all the council meetings. I mean, I sat on the management team. It was me and Sunil, who were the two Americans, basically. Sunil was on the council, Sunil Gulati, and me sitting on the FIFA management team. And I mean, I will say thank you to the FBI, because that led to my job. It was one of the most interesting jobs I've ever had, being the Chief Compliance Officer of FIFA. And I think if the FBI didn't really push for the investigation in 2015, FIFA certainly wouldn't have gone through the reform process they did. And I can also tell you, when I left this summer, I did have a very good feeling about what we had built inside. But again, as what Bonita had said, you know, culture is very important, and you need to drive culture. I mean, culture is very important. Companies know culture is important. If you look at what State Street Capital Partners had released earlier this year, they basically encouraged the boards of all the companies they invest in to come up with metrics to measure your corporate culture, because they think that's going to be the true differentiator in the future. How can companies create a culture where they can manage the next disruptions? And I will say, you can always scrap something and start over, or you can try to change from within. I mean, I made a conscious decision when I joined in 2016 that I was going to join and try to work to help to change from within. Because if you're going to wait for something to be completely erased and start over again, I think we might be waiting for quite a long period of time. But if you recruit and encourage the right people to work in the organization, you will make incremental changes. And those changes do have a big impact. And for the white elephants, I mean, this was something we spent a lot of time thinking about internally. In Qatar, for example, they're trying to make these modular stadiums because exactly what they don't want to have is to have 10 or 8 or whatever 12 stadium sitting in a country that probably needs 2 at max. So they are developing these modular stadiums because that's something we absolutely do not want to see in the future. And I can tell you, when we were evaluating the bid for Morocco versus the United States, Morocco had a bit of a challenge on how they were going to justify all the stadium infrastructure they were going to have to put in place to justify having a tournament as large as the World Cup.
Okay, we have 2 questions left, and I think that's probably all we have time for.
Hi, Edward. This is Stratos Costales. I just have a question. Compliance isn't limited to inflows and outflows of money, correct?
That's true.
Okay, so it has to do with what Jan and Andreas mentioned regarding Infantino secretly putting together a tournament, without the knowledge of everybody that should, have the knowledge of it being planned. But I have a specific question for you. It involves Ability, the FA president from Liberia.
From Liberia, yeah.
Okay. Was investigated.
Yes, I recall.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was a decision. He got busted. But FIFA and Infantino kept it in his, in his back pocket until he opposed the, Samora being imposed on Africa. So basically, I think that happened in February, right? Ability goes against FIFA and CAS in July, right? And then he gets banned for 10 years. So it's a little.
Can we get to the question, please?
Yeah, that's a question. If you're talking about compliance.
We'll leave it there and let him answer. We have one person left to ask.
I mean, so have you ever done a corporate investigation? I can tell you the biggest challenges you have when you run corporate investigations are you never truly find evidence. So if anyone who's ever run a corporate investigation, you 100% you will never find 100% evidence. You will find lots of smoke. You will very rarely find fire. So it's difficult for an organization to try to make conclusive decisions based on what type of smoke do we see. Sometimes you get lucky and you find things that are absolute violations. So I think because it's not my position to describe what we do from internal investigation standpoint, but I will say when evidence comes up that's of a sufficient weight that it should go to the ethics committee. So the ethics committee is the independent organization that would manage dealing with individuals. It goes to that organization and then is evaluated. But my team, when we would learn of something, we had a process. We would look at something within 90 days. We would send people there. We would pull the documents. We would try to come to determination within 90 days because that's the standard we used in pharmaceutical companies as well. And I think almost to an investigation, we probably came to that. But then when you get to the next step, which is going to the independent ethics committee, it's a more challenging process because there's different evidentiary standards, there's different statutory controls that have to be followed. But those two processes are separate. So just because FIFA did an investigation and made a decision with respect to funding for a member association doesn't necessarily mean the person who is elected to run the organization, that member association, in this instance, Mr. Billity, immediately faces suspension. He has to go through then a separate process. And the evidence is then presented.
I'm really sorry. I'm going to cut through. I think that's a fairly full answer. I'll go to the last question, if I may.
This is more of a plea. So as you have started reforms in FIFA, you have shed your people to other sports, and Sheikh Ahmad is now all over swimming. So my plea to all of the journalists and academics in the room is to please start investigating FINA. We would love your support. We need all the help we can get to clean up our sport. And since you gifted him to us, I think you all owe us that. Thank you.
To finish it, I hope I'm not being unfair. I'm going to ask the panel, give us one thing about the new FIFA and the reform you'd like to see, but I'm going to ask Howard a different question. What's his biggest regret? He's just left the organisation. Start with you, Jan. One thing.
Can I wait?
Yeah, if you like.
I did not get the question.
The question for us is what one thing would we change? The question for Edward is, does he regret leaving?
Now, what's the one thing he really regrets that he didn't do? Miguel, will you start us?
Simple and almost impossible at the same time. I think you need to do two things at the same time. One is to open up representation. You should dramatically change who has a vote within FIFA. And second thing, you need to introduce effective independent scrutiny. And this, in my view, will only happen from the outside. It's not necessary that you put an agency governing football. That's not what I'm arguing. But I'm arguing that, and by the way, I'm arguing this with any sports organizations, there should be an agency to license setting certain minimum criteria in terms of good governance, and they shouldn't be able to operate if they don't comply with this. And these two criteria, in these criteria will involve, for example, how representation takes place, how elections takes place, and how the judicial bodies or quasi-judicial bodies, the scrutiny bodies, need to have their independence safeguarded.
Great, thank you very much. Bonita.
When I was part of a group that was a campaign group called New FIFA Now, which I co-founded back in 2014 before the arrests, we built a charter and a set of guiding principles based on three very simple principles. Democracy, FIFA doesn't have it. Transparency, FIFA doesn't have it. And again, I stress I'm talking about the politicians, and accountability. And I think if we got those, as well as Miguel has referred to, some sort of independent external scrutiny, and I would actually like to see a global anti-corruption sports body that goes across all sports and across all areas, then I think we wouldn't necessarily have to take the extreme revolutionary option that I put forward earlier of blowing it up and starting again.
Andreas, then I'll finish with the answer.
I can take it first. Yesterday we heard Federico from FIFA telling us that the 35,000 workers in Qatar who was building the stadiums were treated very well. But there are 2 million migrant workers in Qatar, and they're not been treated very well. So I would like to see FIFA put pressure on Qatar. We are now seeing that more than 4,000 migrant workers will die in Qatar before the first matches will be played, since FIFA gave Qatar the World Cup 2nd December 2010. So put pressure on Qatar. So all the migrant workers in Qatar will have in a decent situation.
Thank you. Andreas.
Okay, I did not get the question, but my answer is my answer is that maybe we should put up a competing football organization that is according to the standards described here, so we can measure FIFA with the new structure, and maybe we have 2 World Cups each second year. That will be good for all football fans.
I'd like to think we'd be around when you can do a meaningful comparison, but I doubt it very much. Right, I've been a very cheeky man asking you the one question about regret, but it seems to me a fair one.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And it was a very difficult decision to leave FIFA. I did surprise FIFA, Fatima, and Johnny when I decided to leave. So I worked through the end of the Women's World Cup and then came back to the United States. But I would say my key regret, because I was asked this before, is I didn't have enough time to really go into the member associations to start helping them institute these types of controls as well. So the first year I did it at FIFA. The second year we really started working on the confederations. We just didn't have enough time to start getting down into the main member associations. Because if you get down into the country level, that's honestly where I think the big change is really going to start to happen, if you can get down into that level.
Well, can I thank the panel for giving me at least a year's worth of teaching content there? Thank you very much. And can I invite you to thank them also?